Hi, I'm Fabiana Jorge from MHA International. I was wondering on the biologic issue whether the issue is a little bit more complex than what was presented by the panel. For instance, it was not mentioned that the Federal Trade Commission has extensively studied this issue and issued a report that concluded that no exclusivity for biologics is required because it's completely different than small molecule drugs. So while you say it was analyzed what happened with small molecule drugs, it's completely different situation with regard to biologics because of investment will require, there will be much less competition, and even after patent expiration and after exclusivity, there will be most of the market share and price maintained by the originator company. So I wonder whether it is a little bit too premature when we have only one biosimilar in this country in the market to lock ourselves forever with a trade agreement and tie the hands of the US members of Congress from ever revisiting the law if it's necessary.
And then the second question.
Yes, hi, I'm Kim Frankener from GAO, and I had a question about implementation and compliance. Basically, you mentioned the hearing that was at Senate Finance a little while ago, and there were quite a number of concerns that were raised, both at the hearing and in connection with it. My question is, what needs to be done to address those problems and to prevent them in the future?
All right, Brian, I think the first one's for you, but then others can weigh in on the second question.
Okay. As I mentioned, you're right. Small molecule medicines, traditional chemical medicines are different from biologics. But in creating the generic pathway for biosimilars in the Affordable Care Act, what the Congress was doing was actually allowing generic medicines, because effectively, prior to the Affordable Care Act, the term of protection for a biologic medicine is infinite. There is no generic pathway. And it was only through the Affordable Care Act that we created the possibility of having a follow-on biologic, or biosimilars they're also called, 12 years after the original approval. So I think, look, Congress has to make policy with the tools that it has available to it. And I think with all of the experience that we had with Hatch-Waxman, which was not, it's not important that Hatch-Waxman was about small molecules specifically. What was important was the balance that was struck between providing the incentives to innovate and providing access to generic medicines at the earliest possible time. And it resulted, Hatch-Waxman resulted in an explosion of innovation and something on the order of 90% generic penetration rate. I think both sides view Hatch-Waxman as a tremendous success. So it makes perfect sense to me why the United States would want to try to replicate that process in the context both of our domestic laws and in our trade agreements.
Patrick, do you want to talk a little bit about the implementation? There's a process in TPA, obviously, that's required to be followed. There's a new customs bill that has some IP provisions.
Sure, thanks, Linda, and thanks for the question, Kim. You know, Chamber about a year ago quietly issued a study that looked at implementation of US FDA IP chapters and found a number of gaps that, some of which came out in the conversation at the Senate Finance Committee hearing the other day. I think it's important in terms of broader context that for the most part, our trade agreements in both the United States and our trading partners have been very well and effectively implemented. But there have been some glaring holes, especially perhaps in the patent space in Chile, for example. But Canada, there are important omissions as well. And this has been a learning process. And I think it's important to recognize that it's only in the last 15 years that we've really had a systemic pursuit of trade agreements on any broad basis. And many of those had long implementation phase-in periods. And what we're finding is that we need mechanisms that provide more certainty in these transitions, that give us more leverage over time as agreements are implemented. I think that will be a big part of getting to a solution with the Chairman Hatch on the biologics issue. just as a baseline, without consideration of the term of RDP, to make sure that we have the tools to effectively enforce what's in the agreement.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks to all the panelists.